Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Taser Yamin for convening these international conferences through ICIE, which gives all of us an opportunity to collaborate and perhaps even to think of cross-cultural research that we can do. And I'm particularly indebted to the co-chairs, Shlomo and Hava, who made it possible for me to bring this DVD to you. So thank you so much, and I will explore spiritual intelligence with you this afternoon. When Paul Torrance and I thought about doing spiritual intelligence, we talked with some of our colleagues. Most of them were pretty positive. Probably one of the most positive was Abraham Tannenbaum from Teachers College at Columbia University, who said, I wanted to write that book. And Paul and I looked at one another and said, we are going to write that book. And so we began to try and build a foundation for the concept of spiritual intelligence. And the negative comments that we had were mostly from people who said, remember in the United States, education is on one side and religion is on the other. And we tried desperately to explain we weren't talking about organized religion, we were talking about spirituality, and that was very different. And then there was a whole group that were just adamant that we shouldn't be doing spiritual intelligence because Howard Gardner had talked about it and had decided that he would not include spiritual intelligence as one of his 7, and of course then he added the 8. And so I said to Paul, how are we going to handle that? And he said, use his words, and that will be our ability to show where we're coming from, Howard's point of view. So I'm going to read to you, it's on page 4, and it's from his Intelligence Reframed, and Howard says, any discussion of the spirit, whether it's cast as spiritual life, spiritual capacity, spiritual feeling, or a gift for religion, mysticism, or the transcended, is controversial, particularly controversial within the sciences, if not throughout the academic world. And then he further stated, regrettably, the majority of scholars in the cognitive and biological sciences turn away from questions of a spiritual nature, consigning this realm chiefly to true believers and quacks. And so one of our colleagues in Denver, Linda Silverman, said that whenever we did a presentation, we should take a little duck and squeeze it and go quack, quack. I don't have a duck this morning, but quack, quack. I'll start now with the first big survey that we did of psychologists to see if there could be a foundation for the concept of spiritual intelligence in psychology. And one of the first psychologists that we worked with was Carl Jung's work. And of course, you know, Carl was very much involved with Eastern mysticism and the ancient traditions, and so he gave us a lot of the ideas in terms of the core experiences. He was very much involved with use of intuition as a way of knowing. He was very much involved with meditation and then visualization. And from that review of Carl's work, we then moved to Abraham Maslow, who talked about the self-actualizing person. And as you read what Abraham Maslow talked about, what the self-actualized person was all about, it's very similar to what Paul and I were thinking that spiritual intelligence and the spiritual behavior of an individual with that would be depicting themselves. And then another psychologist that we were very much impressed with in terms of what he was saying was Viktor Frankl. And then you know, of course, his idea that each of us is searching for meaning. And a psychologist that was particularly helpful to us was Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers had 12 areas that he thought of in terms of the person of tomorrow. And so as we looked at that whole list of his characteristics, many of them were things that Paul and I had talked about in terms of what a person would have if they were indeed spiritually intelligent. And particularly number 12. And in number 12, he said that the person would have a yearning for the spiritual values. And so if you look back at the psychologists that I've mentioned this morning, we had Carl Jung, we had Abraham Maslow, we had Carl Rogers, of course, we had Viktor Frankl, and then one other is Dabrowski. And Dabrowski's level 5, the level 5 development of the individual, is the person who at that point is integrated, is able to see himself or herself within the community and feeling interconnected and living a life of service. And so we felt very good about a foundation in psychology for our concept of spiritual intelligence. The next one that we were going to work with was science, and we were just a little reticent about that, particularly with Howard's statement saying that scientists really were going to see that as irrelevant. And I had done a presentation at one of the National Association for Gifted Children conferences on Nobel Prize winners. And as I read their acceptance speeches and read a little bit about their biographies of their lives, it was very obvious that these people, even though they had Nobel Prize in finance and economics, across the board in many disciplines, that they were highly and deeply spiritual individuals. And so that sort of gave us a positive spin. And then as we got involved in physics, it was like, there it was. You have Stephen Hawking, who has spent his entire life trying to figure out two questions. One is, why are we here? And two is, how did the universe start? And of course, then he says this beautiful statement. He says, when I find the answers to those, I will be looking at the mind of God. And so again, a wonderful statement to build a foundation in science. And of course, the other person that was very helpful to us was Candace Pert. Candace is a neurobiologist, and she has this wonderful idea that every cell in your body is a problem solver. And so that she says, I never talk about the mind and the body, I talk about mind-body. And consciousness is throughout our entire being. And so that gave us that whole notion of consciousness in the mind-body, and then physics was giving us the concept of consciousness in the universe. And so one of the aspects in physics that I'd like to share is that if there are two particles and they're connected, then they're separated. What happens to one particle is reflected in another particle. And then another study in physics that perhaps will lend credibility as well is that they are finding that when a scientist has an experiment and they believe in it, then it's more apt to have a positive effect as they interact with either the plant or the animal or whoever they are actually dealing with. And so if a person is negative, then the experience tends to be negative. And so you're getting the effect of the observer, and that the observer is involved in that. So going back then, we have a beautiful foundation in physics. We have a beautiful foundation in the neurosciences of biology. And then last of all, excuse me, last of all, we looked at brain research. And there's a researcher in San Diego named Ramachandran. And I was very fortunate to be able to be out there and visit in his lab. He was in Israel at the time. And so I met with his graduate students. And part of what they're saying is that there's a part of the brain that is wired for spiritual intelligence. And that when that is happening, then you have a feeling of what they call rapture. And there's a Canadian scientist named Persinger who is working in a similar kind of fashion, and he would put the electrodes on his head himself, and he reported the rapture that he felt while he was doing that. So part of what we're finding when we look at the foundation of science is that there is a part of the brain that's actually wired for spiritual intelligence. And then the third foundation that we researched was looking at ancient traditions, and particularly Eastern mysticism, and then the Native American way. And it was absolutely fascinating because when we looked at Sufism, we looked at the Hermetica, and if you've not read the Hermetica, please go read that, because as you read it, it could have been written yesterday, and it was written during the time of Thoth. And then you had the Kabbalah. We looked at Confucianism, we looked at Buddhism, and so you had all of these ancient traditions, but there was a thread that went through them. And that thread was a search for truth. It was a search for the right way, if you're thinking of Buddhism. It was a search for compassion and very much an involvement with saying that we are part of the earth, and that in particular with the Native American way. So we were excited about that, and we said that we felt that there was a strong foundation in the ancient traditions. And so as we began to look from psychology, science, and the ancient traditions, we came up with this definition. Spiritual intelligence is the capacity to use a multisensory approach, including intuition, meditation, and visualization, to tap inner knowing to solve problems of a global nature. And so we have the intuition, the meditation, the visualization that Jung suggested. We have the inner knowing that was part and parcel of almost all of the ancient traditions, and then solving problems of a global nature. When Paul and I finished looking at those three foundations, we said there's one other thing we'd like to do, and we'd like to emulate what Abraham Maslow did with his self-actualizers. And so we identified some people that we thought depicted spiritual intelligence in their life. And so we have a chapter there, and some of those are Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson. I had interviewed Desmond Tutu. I had met him on the 8th floor of the library, 8th floor of a hotel in Hilton. He was a speaker at one conference, I was a speaker at another, and we were both having an early breakfast. And so I couldn't include it, or we couldn't include it, because the editor had closed that window of involvement. But again, Desmond Tutu, his entire life is an expression of spiritual intelligence. And so that part of what we were able to do then was to pull out likely traits of spiritual intelligence, and then we looked at how educators and caregivers could help to develop and nurture those. And I'm going to pull out just a couple of them to share with you. One is a person who has spiritual intelligence, a young child or an adult, is using inner knowing. And so a lot of times they will come to a response through intuitive thinking, and need to have opportunities to reflect and perhaps to write in journals. So that is extremely important. These are individuals that have a sense of the gestalt and the big picture, and so that they're very much needing to use themes. If you can have a theme that goes through several subjects to pull things together, using maps, the concept maps where they can see the big picture and how everything is related, is very helpful. A person that has spiritual intelligence is someone who's concerned with human suffering. And so again, one of the ways that we could help these children build and nurture their spiritual intelligence is to study lives of eminent people. And so if they're studying the lives of the individuals, such as the spiritual pathfinders that we have in the book, then they would see the similarity that they have with those particular individuals. And then they're peacemakers. They're very concerned when they see that people aren't working together. And so part of what you could do there is to teach them negotiation and conflict resolution skills, and also to be involved in looking at how we can have world peace, and looking at that as a big question. They're very close to nature. If you've ever taken a walk with a young child and has to examine every bug and every leaf as you're going along, these people continue to have that throughout their life. And so that any kind of study that you could do that would employ an eco-environment, so that they could see what we are doing to our environment and what are ways that we can combat big problems such as global warming, and then also the loss of particularly the land in many countries as it's being turned into farmland. And then the one that Carl Rogers had, he said that one of the qualities of the person that is the person of tomorrow is that they have a skepticism of experts, and so that they look toward their own inner self to come up with their values and their directions. And so again, a classroom where there's opportunities for the students to set rules for how they're going to interact with one another. Choice making is extremely important to them because each of those ideas lets them use their own inner knowing in terms of their work. And then last of all, I think the one that is most important is seeking balance. Oftentimes, children who have spiritual intelligence have so many things that they're involved with that they get out of balance. And so this whole notion of using goal setting and using discussion so that they can begin to understand who they are and what their life is all about. And the last thing that I'd like to share with you comes from the work of Fritz Perls. I was very fortunate to be able to do some workshops with Fritz. And Paul and I have been very active with the Creative Education Foundation out of Buffalo. And so we took the work of Fritz Perls and then the work of Sid Parnes out of the Creative Education Foundation and came up with a set of ideas that you could use in terms of developing your own spiritual intelligence. Before I do that, let's look at the spiritual intelligence components, and that'll kind of summarize, and then we'll go into you as an individual. Remember, Paul and I decided that we would use the same format that Howard Gardner used to come up with his other intelligences, that we would do that for spiritual intelligence. So we were looking at what are the core capacities, what are the core values, what are the core experiences, what are the key virtues, what is the symbolic system, and what are the brain states. And so we were able to pull that out of the foundations that we researched in psychology and science and in the ancient traditions. So for core capacities, we said that the person has concern with cosmic and existential issues. And interestingly enough, that's almost exactly what Howard Gardner has added with his existential intelligence. But we also said that the skills that they would use would be meditating, intuition, and visualization. The core values, and if you remember, that was something that Howard was very concerned about. Dr. Gardner felt that there were no universal values, and that was one of the things that we kept seeing over and over again in looking at not only the foundations in psychology, science, and the ancient traditions, but that there were these themes that went through, and one was connectedness. The connectedness of you and I, the connectedness of the earth with the universe, and the idea of unity, unity of all. And then compassion, a sense of balance, I mentioned that before, a sense of responsibility, and then last of all, service, that notion of giving back, that notion of paying back. I remember reading the Essene traditions, and it basically is saying that an individual should first of all find out what their strengths are, and then to be